On January 1st, 1863, just 10 minutes after midnight, Daniel Freedman was at the Brownville, Nebraska land office. He had come from Illinois alone and would soon become the first person to file a claim under the Homestead Act of 1862, just 10 minutes after it had gone into effect. He would go on to receive 160 acres of land for free from the United States government. He built a small log cabin and began to farm the lands, growing corn, wheat, oats, and orchards of apple and peach trees. The land that he and his wife and 8 children resided on is now the site of the Homestead National Historical Park in Beatrice, Nebraska, commemorating the lives and accomplishments of all the pioneers and changes brought by the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln, and in a speech on the 4th of July, 1861, he told the nation that the purpose of America's government was to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial burdens from all shoulders, and to give everyone an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. 100 years later, President John F. Kennedy would go on to say in 1962 that the Homestead Act was probably the single greatest stimulus to national development ever enacted. It gave millions, including immigrants, single women, and formerly enslaved people, a chance to gain assets and begin building wealth. But homesteading was not easy to accomplish. Many people failed, and many died trying. Not to mention the dark history behind the act, as well as the towns that are trying to give away free land to this day. We're diving into all this and more, so settle in as we learn something new. First, let's go over the basics. What was the Homestead Act of 1862? The act, which was passed on May 20th, 1862, granted heads of families 160 acres of public land for free, with the exception of a small filing fee. The fee was $18 at the time, and getting the deed for the land had certain stipulations attached. The person filing for the land was required to be 21 years old and must never have borne arms against the United States government or given aid to its enemies. Remember that part, it'll be important later. Once they were on the land, they were required to stay there for 5 years. Also, they had to build a house on the property and improve it by making a farm or by some other means. They could have gotten around this 5-year waiting period, only needing to stay 6 months, by paying the government for the land, which would run them $1.25 per acre. Okay, so that's what the act was, but this was by no means the beginning of the practice of getting land for free. Squatting was historically prevalent throughout the beginning of the United States. People would come across land that had no clear owners and would claim it for themselves. The government was not only okay with the practice, actively looking the other way when people would work to claim the land, but would eventually go back on their 1830s promise to the Native Americans, saying that they could live in much of the Midwest as their own independent nation in an effort to get more European settlers further west, sprouting farms, towns, and industries as they went. Yet, despite Daniel Freedman racing to be the first to get free land, this was far from a fire sale. In fact, one of the main reasons for the act was because people didn't want to move to the middle of the nation. It had been incorrectly called the Great American Desert early on, a name which would stick around for a long time before being changed to the Great Plains. Not to mention that the act was passed while the Civil War was in full swing. Yes, here we come back to that line from earlier. This was the Union that put the law into motion. They were interested in giving land to those who were in the Union and not the Confederacy. In fact, the Homestead Act had been proposed for years before the Civil War, but the South would always vote against it. It wasn't until they were at war and the South was no longer voting that the act actually went through. And they didn't just say that the Confederates couldn't get free land. They went as far as to say that any Union soldier who fought in the war and wanted to stake their land could subtract his time served in the war from the 5-year wait period before the 160 acres became theirs to keep. Congress also was working to help move people further with the passing of the Pacific Railway Act, which laid the framework for the Transcontinental Railroad. But this wasn't just a domestic issue. A major part of the act was to attract immigrants from abroad, immigrants who would put down roots. To make this point clear, they added extra language in the act saying that any person who is a citizen or who shall have filed his declaration of intention to become such, as required by naturalization laws of the United States, may take advantage of the act. Even the 5-year wait time to get the land was made for immigrants as well, because 5 years was the same amount of time it took to become a citizen back then. So this all sounds great, right? I mean, aside from taking the land from Native Americans who had been there for centuries. The idea that people could come in, even if they had been a slave or if they were a single woman, and could get their own land from the government sounds good. Well, it wasn't as easy as it sounds. Many people tried to get the land, and many failed. Over the 124 years of the act, there were 4 million claims submitted to the government, but only about 1.6 million people actually had deeds successfully claimed. They failed because it was brutal and more expensive than most were led to believe. You had to build everything with what you could cart in on a wagon or use from the land around you. You had to build homes quickly that were often prone to collapsing. People who got injured or sick didn't have anyone they could go to for help, and when crops failed, it didn't just mean losing money. It could mean not having enough food to get through some of the most brutal winters. Becoming a homesteader meant getting your own food, water, and infrastructure set up, often without anyone else outside of your family to help. Despite the low cost of the land, very few laborers and farmers could afford to build a farm from scratch or acquire all of the tools, seeds, and livestock needed to run it. In the beginning of the act, it wasn't very successful. In fact, most of those who gained land from the act did not come from faraway cities, but rather areas very close to the land already. Iowans moved to Nebraska, Minnesotans moved to South Dakota, and so on. The 20th century is where many of the claims and more successful claims came from, especially as the sizes were gradually increased to as much as 640 acres, making irrigation and efficient large-scale farming techniques more feasible. But the Homestead Act came to an end in 1976 for most of the United States. Alaska had it for another 10 years, and during its run, the United States gave 270 million acres worth of land away. That's 422,000 square miles, or 2.5 California's worth of land away. In giving away 10% of the United States' land, it was seen that, of the 30 states deeds were obtained in, Montana had the most successful claims, followed by North Dakota, Colorado, and Nebraska. But despite having the 5th most, Nebraska wasn't suddenly flushed with a population boom. In fact, in the same town where Daniel Freedman became the first to take advantage of the Homestead Act of 1863, Beatrice, Nebraska, a new local Homestead Act was established in 2010. In exchange for free plots of land, you have 18 months to build a minimum of a 900 square foot home and must live in it for at least the next 3 years. And Nebraska isn't the only state that's tried to offer up free land to revitalize their population and economy. Recent versions have been tried in Kansas as well, and they have been far from successful, with most towns barely breaking into double digits, if even getting that many new people. So while you can still get free land today, it isn't really free. It never was, and it certainly won't be anywhere near the 160 acres that you could have received previously. Thank you for watching Learn Something New. If you liked this episode, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more. Thanks again, and as always, see you in the next one.